Okay, so I'm doing something slightly different today. I'm going to be answering some of the most commonly asked questions on the internet about masculinity. So, really excited to do this. I think it's something that I can hopefully offer some perspective from. And if you're new here and if you haven't checked out any of the previous episodes before, everything that I'm about to share is my perspective and not the perspective. But I think these are some really interesting questions to kind of dive into the soil of. So let's get it cracking. The first question that comes up in and around masculinity, or one of the most commonly asked questions on the internet, is what does it mean to be a man? Now, that's a big question. That's a loaded question. That's a question that can go in so many different directions. And honestly, when it comes to the work that I do, I work across several educational spaces. I've worked in schools with young people with masculinities for coming up to 6.5 years now. And this is a question that I often ask, but often a question that gets asked to me as well. And so the way in which I answer the question, or approach it, at least from my perspective, is that when we're talking about what it means to be a man, we kind of have to define masculinity, right? And so for me, how I like to define masculinity is the way in which men perform, embody, communicate their ideas of what it means to be a man. Now, the reason I approach it this way is because I feel like, and this is just me surfacing my opinions in real time, I feel like we've overcomplicated and made this sort of entry point to discourse around masculinity way too academic, way too layered, complex, philosophical, existential, which has its place in the discourse for sure. But when we're speaking to people about their ideas of masculinity, what it means to be a man, we kind of have to start at that sort of level of it's the way in which we perform what we think it means to be a man in the space. And when we look at ways in which ideas of being a man are typically, historically, culturally presented and performed, we then start exploring some of those ideas of masculinity. So the way in which I like to approach that question is through actually taking the time to contextualize masculinity. And what's really interesting about this is I've observed in my work, and this is an offshoot here, but something that I feel is relevant, when I speak to young people about, you know, masculinity, they kind of go, I'm not quite sure. I've heard about it, but I'm not sure how to define it. But when you ask some people, young people, what does it mean for you to be a man? They often come with ideas, opinions, beliefs, expressions that enable them to begin answering that question a little bit more comfortably. And so it's no surprise that this is one of the most commonly asked questions around, masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? But one of the things I'll add to that is, and this we'll probably get into later on as well, what it means to be a man is also really individual. It's really personal. And we've often existed in spaces culturally where the idea of masculinity is so rigid, so kind of confined to a very specific set of behaviors and beliefs and ways of operating, ways of performing, that for many people, many young people, many men in general, there is a tension between who they want to be versus who they feel they need to be. And just a very quick note on what I've mentioned so far about performing. When I'm talking about how we perform our ideas of what it means to be a man, I'm not saying that we're being fake. I'm not saying that we're being, disingenuous. What I am saying is that gender and gender identity is a performance. It's an embodiment. It's an articulation of what we feel is the closest expression to how we feel, or the closest expression to how we think other people want us to be seen and experienced. Gender is a performance. And I'm not just talking about masculinity, I'm talking about gender from a range of different experiences and inputs, right? And so I'm using that language, not to say that, we be out here faking, who we are. And in some cases, as I've just mentioned, guys do perform an idea of masculinity that isn't closely aligned to what they want to be, but who they feel they need to be. But what's really important to recognize in that is that when I mentioned performing, I'm talking about this way in which we embody what we feel, not necessarily saying that we're out here just lying and faking it all the time. Just to be clear. The second question that comes up as one of the most common, most commonly asked questions is, what are the rules of masculinity? Now, this is interesting. This is fascinating. What are the rules? And I think this question is alluding to the sort of conditioned ideas and beliefs that I've just mentioned. The rules of masculinity. What do you do? What do you not do? What's the acceptable expression, and what's the not so acceptable expression of communicating and performing what it means to be a man. And I do see this a lot in my work as well. There is a fixation on doing masculinity right, or doing it in a way where there's less judgment, that in the space, the question is almost asked in a way of like, so what do I do and what do I not do? And how do I do and how do I make sure that I don't do this? There's a very specific, rigid idea of what masculinity often looks, walks, and talks like, that we internalize, and in some spaces we inherit when it comes to masculinities, right? And when we think about the typical rules of masculinity, and for the audio listeners, I've put rules in inverted commas here with my hands. Talk about the rules of masculinity. Often, when I ask the question of what do you associate with being a man, four things usually come up: to protect, to provide, to be in control, and to be a leader. But when we dig in the soul of those ideas some more, to protect is about being physically and mentally strong, and being able to, protect others whilst also protecting yourself. That providing is about being the primary breadwinner. I have to earn the most in a space in my family context, or I need to earn, enough to be able to look after others. And when we're speaking to the other aspects of masculinity, this sort of dominance, control, and leadership, is that I have to be in a position where I'm, always leading from the front, or if not leading from the front, be in a position of leadership. And this often bleeds into the rules of masculinity, how we choose to communicate, how we choose to express, how we choose to embody. There is a fixation sometimes around strength specifically. I need to look physically strong, but I also need to be physically I need to be emotionally and mentally strong as well. I can't show weakness. I can't show vulnerability. I can't show my emotions. I can't show my fear. I can't show my anxiety. I can't show, how I'm feeling today, because it might be seen as X, Y, or Z. And we often walk through life with this sort of internalized rule book, which isn't a concrete rule book. It's a rule book that we've inherited, and a rule book that we've internalized based off of some of the conversations and some of the experiences that we've had around masculinity. I'll share a common trauma that I see in men that I work with, and also young masculinities and teens as well. And I've mentioned this in previous podcast episodes before. One of the most common traumas that as men we have, I believe, in my opinion, is that shared trauma of expressing our emotions at a time in our lives where we were quite young, and being told for the first time, big boys don't cry. All right. We can't do that. You're old enough now. That's not acceptable, or something to that sort of, it's something across that sort of nature, right? Or something in line or similar to what I've just expressed. And I did this the other day at a school I was working at, an assembly that I was facilitating. And I asked that question. It was really fascinating, also a little bit heartbreaking for me. I said it, how many of us in this space have heard at some point in our lives, big boys don't cry, or you can't cry now, you're too old to cry in this space? Most of the guys in the room, they didn't. Some of them nodded. Some of them kind of sat up in their seat and went, was like, yeah. Some of them sort of like chuckled it off as yeah, I felt that. And in that moment, there was an embodied response and an embodied acknowledgement that, yeah, I felt that, and I've experienced that, and I've had to navigate that. And that's one of the rules, if you will, in some of those conversations around what rules of masculinity are. The rule is, you don't show weakness, you don't show emotion, you don't show vulnerability, because vulnerability places you in a position of vulnerability. Now people can see your emotions. Now people can exploit it. We've inherited this narrative that being emotionally expressive or speaking truth to how we feel puts us in a position where we can be, exploited. And I want to maybe explore that in another episode in a bit more depth, because I feel really strongly about this. But that's one of the rules that we often see internalized in men, masculinities, young masculinities, and teens. But I do want to say this: the rules of masculinity, as I've mentioned a couple of times, they are internalized and inherited, but they're not concrete, they're not fixed. And one of the things that I get people that I work with to do is think about some of those rules that they've inherited, and explore and curiously examine whether those rules are helping or hindering their expressions and ideas of masculinity. Because there isn't a rule book for masculinity. We have existed in a culture and a space where we have believed that there is a specific way to be masculine, to express masculinity. But the reality is, going back to that first question that I answered, or the reality is from my perspective, let's not say the reality, let me correct myself in real time there. The perspective that I'm bringing in going back to my definition of what it means to be a man, we're performing and embodying what being a man means to us. So there is no rule book or template. It's something that we're creating and crafting at all times. And if I look back to versions of masculinity that I embodied when I was, say, 18, 19, 21, compared to where I am now at 28, the different masculinities, the different expressions, the different embodiments, not in reference to a rule book, but what I am in reference to is a constant process of exploring, examining, reconfiguring, and designing what I feel is most truthful to me and articulating and expressing that as truthfully as I can. So, bit of a longer answer to that question, but something I felt like I needed to really explore and expand in that sort of, thread, if you will. Okay, look, third question, or one of the most common questions asked is what's the difference, or what is, sorry, healthy versus toxic masculinity? Now, I might ruffle some feathers, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know. And if you follow me and you've heard some of my work before, you've heard me speak before, you probably know where I'm going with this. And I might not even answer the question. I might go on a tangent, but we'll see where it goes. For me, and I've written about this as well. I'm a masculinities educator that works with thousands of masculinities in a range of different contexts. I've gone on record in the past saying, I no longer use terms like toxic and healthy masculinity in the work that I do. And it's not because I don't believe that there are aspects of masculinity and belief systems around masculinity that we've inherited and internalized that can cause harm, that are causing harm, that do cause harm if left unchecked, unexamined, and metabolized. I do believe that there are harmful aspects of what it means to be a man that can manifest into behaviors, beliefs, and embodiments that can cause harm to others and to self. But using frames like toxic and healthy for me reinforces the notion that there's a binariness to masculinity. If you do A, B, and C, you're healthy. If you do, 1, 2, and 3, you're toxic. And there's this sort of perpetuation of there is wholly good and wholly bad, and we're trying to work towards wholly good. But if you do X, Y, and Z right now, you're wholly bad. The reality is, for me, from my perspective, as human beings, we are never in the wholly good or wholly bad sort of camp. And I often use this example in masculinity work, and I put myself on blast all the time in deliveries because there's this you know idea that comes with people like myself doing the work that I do, where it's like, oh, you do such good work and you do this work and you're such a healthy, positive role model. I'm like, I appreciate where that's coming from, and I'm gonna kind of like accept that with the love and warmth that you intended that with, but don't put me on a pedestal, please, respectfully and lovingly, because whilst I might do things that can be deemed as helpful, loving, accountable, etc., guess what? I'm also in proximity to ideas that are also harmful because I've existed in a space and in a culture where some of my ideas that I have might be rooted in something I need to explore and examine. Just because I do something that's helpful and something that might be deemed as healthy or positive doesn't mean that I'm not in proximity to behaviors, beliefs, ideas that need to be worked on and explored. I like to use wholeness as a term when discussing masculinity because we can work towards being better and improving aspects of what we think being a man looks, walks, and talks. That we can work on our emotional expressiveness, we can work on our accountability, we can make room for, vulnerability, we can make room for being allies, being, upstanders in the space. We can do all this work whilst also digging deep in the soil of our heart and in our belief systems and extracting some of those beliefs, those experiences, those framings that, if left unchecked, can be, perpetuated or potentially influencing harmful frames or frames that need to be looked at and examined. That's all of us, by the way, myself included. So I don't tend to use healthy versus toxic for that reason. But what I often see is that sense of if you do X, Y, and Z, you're toxic. If you do A, B, and C, you're healthy. When the reality is, for me, again, as humans, we are always striving to be better and improve, but we must always hold ourselves to account and, look at um, our shortcomings with as much honesty as our successes. That for me is massively, massively important in this work. So I'm not technically answering that question, but what I am saying is, healthy and toxic, whilst it serves a purpose in some of the discourse, I feel like because it's so binary, we often approach the discussion with such activation that we're not actually recognizing that we're all in this system where we can be improving and getting better, but also needing to dig in the soil of our heart as well and sort of really extract some of those ideas that we've inherited and internalized, all of us, myself included. So I just wanted to add that into that question. And finally, for this episode, this question is a really interesting one, and I've got probably my shortest answer for this, but then I will see how I feel, because I do feel passionate about this as well. How do I balance masculinity with being emotionally open? It's a really interesting question, and my short answer is you don't. You are emotionally open, and you work towards being emotionally open. There's this idea going back to, how we think, or what we think being a man is, and some of those rules that we might internalize, that we think, okay, so how do I balance that with being emotionally open? You don't. You are emotionally open, or you're working towards being emotionally open. Being emotionally open and expressive doesn't make you less of a man, right? Like, that's not how this works. Being emotionally open and expressive, taking time to explore and project what you feel, and to honor those emotions and feelings that you have, is massively important, specifically as men. Okay. Like, you don't balance it by, how do I be, nonchalant and also feel, hey, let's throw that respectfully and lovingly in a box far away. Because emotional openness and expressiveness is not just something that should be attached to masculinity. It's a human trait. Emotional expressiveness is human. And when we shut the door to emotional expressiveness, we shut the door to aspects of our humanity. There's no balance. We can work on that skill of expressiveness and openness, because in some spaces and places, as I've mentioned, some of that shared trauma that, big boys don't cry, that type of stuff, we've got to work through that. We've got to dig in the soul of our heart and really extract and lovingly metabolize those beliefs. But for me, there isn't a balance. You are emotionally expressive, or you're working towards being more emotionally expressive, and that doesn't make you less of a man. That makes you more of a human being. So those are the 4 questions I wanted to touch on in this episode today. Very, off the cuff for me. So just as I'm surfacing in real time, one thing I want to be really clear on as well is if you're still kind of listening to this and going, wait, I'm still not quite sure about some of these questions and ideas. There's, lots of different ways and I suppose perspectives you can take on what I'm sharing. This is my perspective, as I've said, not the perspective, but what I think is really important. And I'll do a summary in terms of some of the things that I've brought forward, and hopefully, if I haven't, expanded on that in other sort of questions that I was answering, it's kind of covered in this summary section. We're talking about masculinity. We're talking about the ways in which we project and embody ideas of what we mean, or what it means to be a man. But those ideas historically have been positioned and rooted in, physical strength, emotional resilience or lack of emotional expressiveness, being a protector, being a provider, being a leader, being in positions of control, perhaps dominance in some spaces. But really and truly, these ideas, these rules, don't serve us as men. What they do is they place us into a box. And that box, if not explored and examined, can feel like it gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And it feels like there's not room for us to express and explore who we are in the space. Who we are as individual expressions of masculinity is massively important, because there is no monolith or template experience to masculinity. That, for me, is a product of the system that we exist within, that would love us to believe that there is this way of being a man and everything else is wrong, incorrect, X, Y, or Z. But what I'm trying to say to you in this space here is that your ideas and your articulations of masculinity, if you're emotionally expressive, if you find yourself engaged in hobbies that might not be deemed as traditionally masculine, so what, bro? That's you. As I've said in previous episodes, that's you. We've got to make room for ourselves to be present within those embodiments of masculinity. Because if we don't, we're playing a character instead of expressing and articulating who we are in the space. And who we are in the space can change, can adapt, can evolve over time. I've mentioned this briefly in this episode, but some of my ideas of masculinity as an 18-year-old compared to who I am now at 28, massively different. Massively different. I had to dig in the soul of my heart and think about some of those ideas that I've got there are quite harmful. Some of my ideas about what I think it means to be a man. Some of the ideas of what I think, a man's purpose is in the world. How I enter conversations around gender equity, or how I feel about specific, experiences, and how I contextualize women's experiences, and how I sort of approach conversations around women's experience. I had to do that work. And if it's useful, I'm happy to do another episode on that, because I feel like that in itself is, something that could be useful to a lot of yourselves that tune in. But what I'm saying is, this process of holding, articulating, and embodying a masculinity is a process that goes across life. To quote one of my mentors, Bill Hill, it's lifelong and life-wide. It's supposed to change. It's supposed to evolve. And we're in a position right now as men where ideas of masculinity are being placed under the microscope. They are being placed in proximity to us that might feel uncomfortable. We're having to look at our behaviors and not just look at them, but almost think about and justify why we think that's acceptable. And that can be registered as attack at times. That can be registered as, oh my gosh, this is anti-masculinity. But it's not anti-masculinity. It's an invitation to explore and examine how you present and articulate what you feel it means to be a man. And in a space and time when we're talking about things like misogyny, sexism, violence against women and girls, and we're also speaking to the experiences of men around mental health and expressiveness and making room for emotional, expression in lovingly and compassionately our ideas of masculinity and our proximity to the conversations that might feel uncomfortable, that we often approach from a very specific vantage point and don't consider different ideas and perspectives. Hey, listen to me, please. It's important that we explore that. We don't just take it as this is who I am and I'm not changing. We look at ourselves and our expressions and our embodiment as an opportunity to constantly mend, to constantly amend, to constantly build, and at times when necessary, metabolize and reconstruct. The context that we're in right now as men and as allies to movements around tackling things like misogyny, sexism, violence against women and girls is important. We have to do the work. We have to explore. We have to examine ourselves in this context, because if we don't, we might be reinforcing ideas and beliefs that are compounding the harm that we're wishing to dismantle and get rid of. So that's a little rant to end this episode today. Thank you so much for rocking with me. If you are here towards the end, I appreciate you. If you like this episode and you're thinking, yeah, do some more of these because they're kind of like answer some of the questions that I might have or things that I'm exploring, thinking about, let me know, because I'm happy to do them. And they are very much off the cuff. And what I'll probably do at some point in the future is do a follow-up episode going, oh, actually, in that answer, I missed this out because I was kind of flowing off the top of my head. And I really am approaching this episode from a position of, this is how it's landed for me right now. So there will be things that I might add and explore later on in previous episodes, in more episodes. I'm happy to do that. But if you do like this format, do let me know. I appreciate you. And I will see you in a future episode very, very soon. Big blessings. Stay safe. Yeah. Chat to you soon. Bye-bye.